Hey, everybody. By all means, please eat. I mean, we need you fed for the afternoon. But in the meantime, we have some entertainment for you. My name is Michael Horowitz. I'm a senior adjunct fellow here at CNAS and a political science professor at Penn, and I am delighted to be moderating this session on advancing American leadership in artificial intelligence. We have an incredible panel for you. To my left is Amanda Askell, who's a research scientist in ethics and policy at OpenAI. We have Frederick, who you heard from earlier today, who's an associate fellow in the Technology and National Security program at CNAS. To her left is Elsa Kania, who's a PhD student at Harvard and also an adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS. And then Ashley Llorens, who is the chief of the Intelligent Systems Center at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, which is another way of saying that he actually knows things about the technology. And we have a really exciting program. We're going to start with a talk from Amanda about the state of artificial intelligence and some of the issues that we need to be thinking about. We'll then transition into a moderated discussion before opening things up to the audience for questions. So without further ado, Amanda, you're on.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, so I'm just going to be talking a little bit about what is AI. I'll just give a kind of quick introduction to the sort of systems that we see today and hopefully some of their implications. So I think first it's kind of useful to start off with these rule-based systems, because I think this is what comes to mind when people think about artificial intelligence. So first, you have a problem. So this might be navigating a maze. So move left or right is your problem. And then you have a rule that you construct. So a human is going to write a rule to say what to do in these cases. So if the lava is left, then move left is an example of a rule that you could kind of just put in here. Then you might test that rule. And in this case, you'd say, well, that's bad. My agent just died because it moved into lava. And so then you go back and you reevaluate your rule. And this is, again, a human doing this. If the lava is right, then move left is another example. This one's great. So you found a solution. And so I think this is kind of the very old school, kind of good old-fashioned AI. You just have a series of if-thens, and there's a lot of human input. And I think people can forget how much real human input there was to early AI systems. If you look through things like Deep Blue, the amount of just actually hand-designed kind of rules that were in there is really fascinating. But one of the key kind of problems that arose out of the kind of good old-fashioned AI paradigm was it became clear, so this is a quote from Moravec's paradox. It has become clear that it's comparatively easy to make computers exhibit adult-level performance on intelligence tests or playing checkers, and difficult or impossible to give them the skills of a one-year-old when it comes to perception and mobility. So this is what we saw arise out of these kind of rule-based systems. And to exemplify that with an XKCD comic, which says, when a user takes a photo, the app should check whether they're in a national park. Sure, that's an easy lookup, give me a few hours. And it should also check whether the photo is of a bird. I'll need a research team in 5 years. And I think this is this was a key problem for these early systems. And so I think it's really worth keeping in mind that the difference between hard and easy problems is almost reversed when it comes to people and to machines. So the problem, what is 1.19 times the square root of 109,871? That's a pretty difficult problem for a person. They might need to sit and take a little while to work that out. It's extremely easy for a machine. In fact, you can just plug it into a calculator. You get a result really easily. That's a very simple system. Here's problem 2, though. Is this a stop sign? Extremely easy for humans. We just look at it and we're of course it's a stop sign. It's incredibly hard for machines. And so this is how we get to kind of machine learning-based AI. So we have this really hard problem of trying to identify whether this is a stop sign. In this kind of paradigm, what we do instead is we give it a bunch of data. So we find lots of pictures of stop signs and non-stop signs. And instead, the human is inputting an algorithm. So they're adjusting this learning algorithm. From that, you have the agent give an action or a prediction. So in this case, it's a prediction about whether it's a stop sign or not. And you have a reward or penalty based on whether it's correctly identified that it's a stop sign. And then that's fed back into the learning algorithm itself to improve the algorithm. And so this happens again. And ideally, you do this about maybe 10,000 times if it's a really simple problem. and you get a trained model out of this. And this gives you a solution to your problem. The key thing that I want to note here, this is kind of a simplification. There's human input everywhere. But one of the really interesting things about machine learning-based AI is that you've essentially taken the human a little bit out of the learning loop. So earlier we had to have humans basically hand design a bunch of these algorithms, whereas now you can let your model train and improve itself, then you can come in and you can tweak it, you can add more data. But I think it's really important that you've taken the human to some degree out of the loop here. And so you'll see pictures like this perhaps. This is just kind of a neural network. And what's actually going on there is this image is being divided into a bunch of pixel data. And then this is being fed into say a series of neurons here. So this is just a neural network, really simple example of one. It's got different weights, and it's using these weights to determine whether it's a stop sign or not. And if it gets it incorrect, that's fed back through the network. So that was just the kind of inner body of some of the things that I talked about there. So I think another good way of thinking about machine learning, just to kind of wrap this up, is imagine you want to teach. It's a bit like trying to teach someone a really complex gymnastic routine, and all you have is a clicker. So if you like what they do, you click yes, and if you don't like what they do, you just don't use your clicker. You can't communicate with them. You can't give them any instructions. You can't go in and hand feed a rule to them. You're just clicking yay or nay. And that's I think a kind of good thing to kind of keep in mind when it comes to these systems. So I just want to give an overview of things I think are really important for AI. So first is hardware and algorithms. So more and better hardware just means that you can train larger models with more data and less time. So here's an example of OpenAI 5, which is a Dota playing AI system from OpenAI. And you can see here the training petaflops per day and how they are increasing over time. And this just requires a lot of hardware. Better algorithms means that you get greater efficiency and accuracy, and you have an ability to solve new tasks. Then the other key thing, which obviously is very important, is data. So more data just means better and more accurate models, and also an ability to solve new tasks. So here's OpenAI 5 actually playing Dota, and this is from 2017. So this is an interesting game because it's got a lot of kind of strategic elements and different agents playing together. So it's very complex, lots of information. OpenAI 5 trained on 250 years of simulated Dota experience per day, and over 45,000 years of Dota play in 2019. So this is just to give you a sense of how much data you need to train some of these systems and how important it is. But we've seen a lot of progress in things like reinforcement learning and in other areas, but I'll talk a little bit about reinforcement learning here. So this is from 2013, learning to play Atari games using reinforcement learning. In 2015, obviously we had AlphaGo from DeepMind, which was a very key moment in AI. And then, we've got now, we're training on systems like Dota and playing more complex games. So I just want to conclude with sort of risks and benefits of AI. Promise I'll stop talking soon. So first, I think it's worth noting that because these systems aren't just these simple rule-based systems, they're incredibly complex. Things can go wrong in ways that you don't anticipate. So this is an example of an AI system that was trying to train to complete this course in a boat racing game. Now the issue is that the reward is basically for how well you're doing in the game. So imagine it's you have points, and you want to you want to see this agent just get to the end of the course and win. But what it actually did was it discovered this little part of the course where it could get lots of turbo points. And because it's getting a reward for getting these turbos, it just starts crashing into the walls and forming this circle to just keep getting these turbos. So it never actually completes the task that you wanted it to complete, because it was getting a reward for things like points in the game as well as whether to win the game. And so you can see this kind of behavior that you don't anticipate. So here the wrong goal was learned. It's optimizing for the wrong problem. And it's worth noting that the kind of goals that humans optimize for are exactly in the class of hard machine problems that I talked about earlier. To us, it's super obvious that you just you shouldn't crash and cause your boat to go on fire if you're playing a boat racing game. It's very much not obvious to an AI system. And often this can mean that it has negative side effects. So here, your boat is literally on fire. I really don't want this agent controlling a boat that I'm on. That's a bad side effect of this poor goal. Finally, the learning process can be harmful, so you can explore really harmful options. Like here, if I have this system and it's training not just prior to deployment, but like, it's doing online training, you don't want it to explore options like this when it's trying to like learn about its environment. These are just very harmful options. It can also respond really poorly to new data. I could train something and then just the world changes enough such that when it's like out in the world, it just does extremely poorly. Moreover, detection of this is extremely difficult and costly, at least at the moment. These models are like very large. They aren't rule-based models, so we can't just go in and like look at like what rule it's using. And so sometimes finding out like that this is going to go wrong is like very costly. And there's obviously work being done in this, but like it's worth noting that as these systems get more complex, being able to basically work out whether something is going to go wrong is like much harder. Okay, how am I doing on time? Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about like misuse risks and societal harm. So here's like an example of like a large language model. I won't read this out to you, but basically what you can do here is like, so this is from this GPT-2 from OpenAI. The first line here was like an input into the system, so it was like a train carriage containing controlled nuclear materials was stolen in Cincinnati today, its whereabouts are unknown. And the system just completed this with essentially an article. So if you wanted to have like misinformation that read a lot like what humans write, and you just wanted to produce it at like mass scale, then such systems could be very useful for you. So this is one example of like potential misuse. Things like facial recognition and privacy, people are obviously concerned about, and could cause like a lot of social disruption if it's used badly. Automation in the nature of work, decision-making systems and bias and discrimination, AI weapons and social and global security. So these are all like issues where you have potential social harms and also potential misuse by bad actors, and it's worth keeping this in mind. Definitely the last slide, however, I want to like kind of conclude by noting AI is also potentially extremely beneficial. I've talked about some of the problems and difficulties with AI, but if you take language models, they can provide assistance with writing and day-to-day tasks. They can be applied to large and complex problems like climate change. They can enable like new innovations in areas like healthcare and education, and they can be used to drive economic growth and reduce the need to work. And so I think that it's worth noting that like the potential upsides are huge, even though there's obviously all of these difficulties that we should keep in mind. And that's everything I have to say.
Thank you. Given that in the national security community, we're often in the business of just laying out like all the ways that things can go haywire. I mean, really, like that isn't that our job? It was nice to see you end on a positive note in some ways. And I want to start the conversation by turning to Ashley. And since your work, your research focuses a lot on questions of trust in AI and trust in autonomous systems, given some of the accident risks and other negative side effects that Amanda brought up, how should we be thinking about ways to leverage AI to deal with those? How do you build trust between humans and machines, whether we're talking about in the military realm, in the economy, or other areas?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I really liked the intro presentation, and just picking up from where Amanda left off there. I mean, we've done amazing things with that good old-fashioned AI, right? Like, so folks at my lab sent the New Horizons NASA mission 10 years, 3 billion miles to take pictures of Pluto, and that was the first thing you showed, right? So that's that era has produced some amazing things. But I think we all recognize now that machine learning is really, I don't think I'm overstating to say it's forming a new foundation for artificial intelligence. And so now we're trying to figure out how to reconstruct the scaffolding on how we create these intelligent systems that can, explore the edge of the solar system, or keep our our cyber networks safe, right? So this is kind of the landscape, and what I want to try to do is just sketch out this really hairy, thorny problem of trust in this landscape. How do you reap the value from AI? You have to trust it enough to delegate some task to it, some decision, some action at a distance, or some action in the planetary exploration sense, or some action maybe in close partnership. Let's say robot-assisted surgery, right, where maybe the robot has a steadier hand to lay in some sutures on a battlefield or something like that. And so now you've got this multi-scale trust problem. As a society, we have to figure out, in the first place, which kinds of decisions and actions are appropriate to delegate to a machine. I'm not going to go off and build something that society has said that's inappropriate for a machine. So there's a society level trust problem, and the results of that discussion manifest in our policies, right? And then there's an institutional level trust. In national security, this may be kind of the test and evaluation apparatus where good ideas that come up in labs like ours really have to pass pass muster and be rigorously evaluated before it's ever put into someone's hands. So now you have institutional trust, test and evaluation, verification, validation, and then you have these individual decisions that need to be made in the context of human-machine teams. So now you've got a soldier on a battlefield or a doctor in a hospital that has to make the final decision. Someone said this works well enough, they put it in their hands, but they have to make the final decision to do the delegation. So there's this multi-scale trust landscape. And I think we have to consider that landscape as we think about how to get the value from AI. As a society, at the policy level, how do we start to make our policies more informed by the limitations, the opportunities and limitations of the technology? I see the need for a lot more nuance in that discussion. From the T&E standpoint, how do we start to really bridge the gap between things that we see in clean simulated environments, maybe even mixed reality environments and real world testing? How do we start to bridge that gap? And in the human-machine teaming context, how do we start to make experimentation safe? Understanding that we're not going to get a full knowledge of the system performance, a complex system in a complex environment. How do we deal with making experimentation safe? How do we evolve our sense of accountability to do that? So those are some of the issues, and maybe depending on how the discussion goes, we may get deeper into some of them.
So thanks very much, Ashley. So, Elsa, you've researched and written a lot on what China is doing in this space, and of course we're used to America being number one. Nothing to worry about. Is that the case today? What does China's research in some of these areas look like, and how real is the risk of China taking the lead, whatever that means exactly, in artificial intelligence?
Thank you. I suppose I'd say to start that I do still think that American leadership in AI is ours to lose. We have an advantage for the time being, and I think we should recognize some of our strengths, including talent, including be home to a lot of the cutting-edge research today. But I do think that concern with China's rise in AI, so to speak, is warranted, though it can also be exaggerated. So again, I think that there has been quite striking ambition on the part of Chinese leaders, most notably in a plan that declared the intention to lead the world in AI by 2030. And increasingly, there's not just the rhetoric and Xi Jinping calling for China to seize the strategic commanding heights in this new realm of scientific competition, but also quite robust research and development across a very diverse ecosystem, from universities that are at the forefront of new advances in machine learning and brain-inspired intelligence to companies that are a new national team leading open innovation platforms, things like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, iFlyTech, SenseTime, among others, working on very practical applications in smart cities, self-driving vehicles, healthcare, and otherwise. So, and I think increasingly, if you look at the numbers, patents and publications, China has, and in some respects already has surpassed the US and is on track to continue going forward. I think at the same time, there also are some critical weaknesses in China's innovation ecosystem, from shortfalls in talent to relative backwardness in some key and core technologies, including some of the hardware frameworks, next generation algorithms. And I suppose you could say I'm old enough to remember when the thought of China leading in AI was dismissed outright, and when there was really deep skepticism of Chinese innovation. I think today, if anything, our assessments have recalibrated towards concern that China is already beating us in everything. I think neither is quite true. The reality is always somewhere in the murky middle, and it's inherently challenging to try to assess what the landscape looks like or what it even means to lead in AI when we're talking about a general purpose technology with very diverse techniques and applications, and for which the status of progress looks very different depending on if you're looking at, for instance, something like facial recognition, where Chinese companies that can benefit from access to massive amounts of data and a market for surveillance technologies have become quite dominant in some respects, relative to looking at advances in weapon systems, where the Chinese defense industry is quite robustly pursuing research, including in hypersonics, and there's also some interesting applications in education. sort of customized techniques for learning that are quite actively being pursued by a number of startups in China to new advances in healthcare. And I think sometimes China is talked about as a AI superpower because of their strength in these applications, as well as their access to massive amounts of data. And I think they're certainly a powerhouse, perhaps not quite a superpower yet, and may not be, depending on how this competition and cooperation in this field do play out. But I think if you look, for instance, at something like biotechnology, including precision medicine, where Chinese companies and researchers do have access to massive amounts of data that could provide unique insights, including whether for medicine or human enhancement or otherwise. So I think it's quite a complicated landscape, and one where I think we will continue to see this play out for years and years to come. And too soon to say who is winning.
So Kara, you spoke this morning about sort of high-tech illiberalism and the way that China is developing and exporting digital authoritarianism, and those are all like scary words essentially, and especially in combination. But how does when it comes to how China thinks about using AI compared to how, say, the United States thinks about using AI, what are some similarities and differences in the approach?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. In canvassing some of the people in Silicon Valley, talking to people of Amanda's ilk, I used to work there myself. You have people sort of highlighting the fact that there are similarities, right? So we use facial recognition. San Francisco just passed a law banning municipal agencies from using facial recognition, and there's been, an uproar about, how can we condemn what they're doing over there if we're doing similar things here? I mean, we're not. The technology could be the same, but as I said earlier today, it's the laws and the policies that govern the use of these technologies that are critical. It's how we use the technologies that matter the most. So China is using, these AI-driven technologies to actually entrench their social control over their population and exert that control within their own borders. But in the United States, I mean, sometimes it is as one thing, facial recognition-wise, to, it's not the determinant of whether or not somebody is arrested. It's pointing these law enforcement agencies in the right direction. If people feel like these are being abused, then, like I talked about before, there's an engaged citizenry. There's a mechanism for recourse. There's the ability for people to petition, their communities. In the San Francisco area, there's a sort of a neighborhood watch kind of entity that does that, and their job is to talk to law enforcement if they think that they've gone too far. That happens in America, but in most instances in China, Elsa will be the better arbiter of this, but I don't see that happening at all. So it's when we have the ability to stay engaged as citizens, to talk to our law enforcement and the people that are making these policies, and then the integrity of the policies themselves and how they're meted out, that's what is critical. It's very, very important that we don't just say all technology is bad because it's being used poorly. That doesn't work. While there are similarities in the function of the technology themselves, it is being used vastly differently, and we have a whole apparatus of protections here in America and in most free democratic societies that'll prevent it from, being pushed over the edge.
So it's less about the technology itself and more about how you use the technology that might be important for some of these things.
Precisely.
And that actually bridges to the question that I want to ask Amanda. Is you gave us that was an unbelievable introduction to the topic, and that section on risk, right before you ended on the happy note, was really persuasive in a lot of ways. So my question for you is, all right, what do we do?
Oh, great, I got an easy one.
and by that I mean all right, so we have these challenges of trust, and Ashley, outlined some of that even more. And there are all of these risks of accidents and risks, challenges in AIs performing effectively. Yet, the technology will advance, and both companies and countries will use it. What do we do to ensure that we get that beneficial outcome rather than the more negative outcome?
Yeah, so I guess I could talk about a couple of things. There's a lot of things that I feel like people should do. So I think one thing that Ashley touched on a little bit and that I would kind of emphasize is enabling the evaluation of systems. So at the moment, I think this key point of how difficult systems are to interpret, how difficult it is to know what they will do when deployed in a kind of novel environment, means that you really want to have a way of being able to both look at to interpret the system better, so to anticipate what it will do and to avoid some of these accidents, I think also being able to like measure social outcomes is another kind of important thing here. So these are like both different kinds of evaluation. So one is like evaluation of the system, and I think another is being able to like, so with things like automation, there's like a lot you can do in theory to try and work through what the implications of that will be. But then in practice, you could find that like it has an impact that you didn't anticipate, that like people are less willing to like move around for work than you anticipated, for example, and that could just radically change the outcomes. And so I think having, at the moment, we're probably just not like actually trying to gather the relevant information about the impact that these systems are having, and having that information allows you to respond to it. So these two kinds of evaluation seem like very important to me. And then also having systems, if you understand and it is the case that you don't fully know what a system is going to do, having things in place so that when something goes wrong, it doesn't go disastrously wrong is like very important. So if you're deploying a system in a domain where if
I was going to ask for an example.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, sometimes I've used examples of like navigation systems before. I'm like, suppose you're navigating like a ship, for example, or even just like a commercial ship, and you know that there's like an agreement between two countries that their commercial ships won't move outside of like this region of space. Even if you have a human in the loop, you have a human saying yes or no to the system. Humans very often just say yes. If you're used to the system just working, you eventually just kind of say yes to it. I think people will know this like themselves. Like I just, it's like if your phone asks you to do things, you're often just like yes, 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 yes. And so you could have a system like that, and then it reads some new information. Maybe there's a hurricane, or there's just like new data that it's not encountered before, and suddenly it's actually recommending that you go into the course that it's been agreed is like a no-go. I think in that kind of situation, you want to have agreements that are sensitive to that kind of mistake. So ideally, you have an agreement with like the other, perhaps like the other company or the other state that is understanding of the fact that your system can go wrong and like what happens when it does go off course. So that it's not some major disaster that can kind of blow up out of control, but rather something that is like, just a contingency that people have prepared for. So I think those are like a few different things that you can, can be done. I feel like I wanted to talk about other things that can be done, but maybe I should let other people talk. So yeah, I think like actually knowing more about the systems, knowing more about their impact in the world, and like being very aware that this isn't just a kind of like simple if-then system and that things can go wrong in ways you didn't anticipate is probably very valuable.
That's great, and I want to turn essentially from the, in some ways to the exact title of this this sort of panel, and you all have expertise in some overlapping, some slightly different aspects of this, and what I would like each of you now to do, and by the way, they have no idea I'm going to ask this question, is sort of tell us one thing that you think the U.S. government should do to try to improve the chances of American leadership in artificial intelligence, and one thing the U.S. shouldn't do. Who wants to go first? Ashley? Well, no, so here, I'll filibuster for a second while you think of an answer. Your work, in some ways, you've been on the ground focusing on these questions of sort of trust and autonomous systems in your research, and you do work with the U.S. government in thinking about AI and autonomous systems. And so, in some ways, what I'm asking is to sort of go up a level of aggregation to policy in a way, but I think you're very well poised to do that. So why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I tried to lay this out in my initial remarks, I think we need to look at that whole trust landscape and figure out how to drive interconnections. If you just think about this notion of generalization of knowledge to new situations, Amanda talked about this. This is kind of like the hallmark of human intelligence and something that's really, really hard for machines. And it's a harder question to try to answer. On the one side, developing a system. Can I make this system do this trick under some known conditions versus under which whole range of conditions will the system do this trick, to a suitable degree. So I think, we have to figure out, first of all, we have to advance the science and technology of test and evaluation of AI-enabled systems. So I think that's an investment that really needs to be more robust, multidisciplinary. And then the results of that progression need to form a really tight feedback loop with our policymaking apparatus. And so, just for example, it's not typical for us to have a nuanced conversation about uncertainty in our policy conversation. I mean, I just haven't seen it as
Yeah.
much. I'm not deep into those circles, but you know, a lot of times we say if an autonomous system is in this position and it sees 2 people over here and 3 people over here, well, first of all, hold on, that's not really how machine perception works. There's going to be confidence values associated with those. There's going to be some kind of a planning apparatus that's doing some route planning or trajectory planning on the basis of uncertain perception. So somehow that degree of nuance has to get into the policy conversation.
Feedback into the policy.
Yes, there needs to be a feedback loop.
Yeah.
So that's the one very simple thing I would say. But it's again that the test and evaluation. How do we test the generalization performance of AI-enabled systems, and then how do we start to make policy choices based on that foundation?
And what shouldn't we do?
We shouldn't not do that.
Man, you try to get people to answer the questions, and they dodge you. All right.
All right.
Elsa, you're up.
I think first and foremost, we need to concentrate on education. And I think if we are looking at the long-term trajectory of rivalry with China, talent will really be the critical determinant of comparative advantage going forward. So on one hand, I'm very heartened that the Department of Defense has launched a great strategy for AI. On the other hand, I wish the Department of Education were equally active in thinking about ways to both enhance STEM education and to leverage AI to augment existing educational opportunities. And I think ensuring that there is equality of opportunity in STEM education, as well as thinking about the interdisciplinary intersections in these fields, will really be critical going forward to build a pipeline as well as to facilitate some of the adjustments in our workforce and society going forward. And as for what we should not do, I think I'd be concerned to see any restrictions on immigration, because I think when we are thinking about our long-term competitive advantage, I think openness and inclusion and welcoming students and scientists from all over the world is absolutely vital. And I hope that we can sustain that and embrace that as a source of strength and recognize that that is something unique to the United States and something I hope we can uphold. And that is, I think, I think it remains to be seen what leadership in AI means exactly. I think that is to be determined, what metrics we use, what priorities we set. But I do think focusing on the human dimension of this technology and both building a pipeline of talent and welcoming talent and ensuring that our development is in line with our values is one way to set a foundation going forward, not only for AI, but for the range of emerging technologies that will really shape the course of the century, perhaps.
Yeah, immigration, totally not controversial right now. Kara.
All right, so my real one is Elsa's. It's talent. And this was inspired actually by a lot of Elsa's work too. It's treat talent as a strategic imperative. We're not used to looking at it as a national security imperative, but it will play that role increasingly. And there should be all sorts of on-ramp, off-ramps, give people a taste, whet their appetite for the Pentagon, Silicon Valley, vice versa. There's a lot of programs right now that are happening that, okay, you can dip your toes in the water a little bit, but allow the smart people in uniform to go to Silicon Valley and then come back. Give them a concrete pipeline. There are sort of embryonic initiatives right now. A concrete one is the Air Force is actually getting Python to count as a language. So I think that those things are steps in the right direction to fostering the workforce that we need of the future, like Elsa said. But for diversity's sake, my second one would be make software sexy. Having, I don't know how. Yeah, exactly. Give people promotions for doing better.
Yeah.
Emphasize the mission over the platform. I understand, I've used to great advantage in the field, some of these beautiful machines that get your targeting work done. But at the same time, it's the software that really is running these to their full effect. And let's make sure that we, as Paul said, he's going to kill me, but payload over platform, software over payload. That's something we need to impress upon our workforce, especially those in the Pentagon when we're talking about military applications of artificial intelligence. And then really quickly, what we should not do, we should not invest in R&D.
Oh my God. I know, right? All right. I mean, Amanda, I'm curious to hear you say, because coming from Silicon Valley, from a place where a lot that's on the cutting edge and developing a lot of these technologies. We all know there's been maybe like a little bit of tension between Silicon Valley and DC over AI over the last year. So what do you think? What should the U.S. government be doing, and what should it not be doing?
Yeah. Although on that, I guess one point that I always want to make is Silicon Valley isn't one thing. There's lots of different companies. There's lots of different people at those companies. So like what I say won't represent what other people think. I'm just like representing my own views. And I think that it's interesting that I think people tend to see like other people as like a kind of monolith, like there's just one opinion, and then themselves it's like, oh, but we have a diversity of opinions.
It's very complicated.
Yeah, so like worth noting is probably just that like in DC and in Silicon Valley, there's probably just a diversity of opinions across people. I do think, I guess, in some ways, and maybe this does get to the difference, because the thing that I kind of wanted to say was I almost like want to reject the premise of the question, or at least question it. So like, on the one hand, I guess the question was like about American leadership, and part of me is like, look, imagine you have like two companies, and one of the things that they can do is they can try and basically fight like with one another about, so they're just thinking about like, all I want to do is like get one over on my rival. I just want to be the biggest company in this domain. And then you have like another situation in which they're focused more on the potential for mutual gains. And so they're focused on things like, well, like, look, if we both agree to make sure that our systems are like safe and good in like product safety, for example, then like the market will be larger, and also we won't design harmful products. And this is what happens in industry, like supported industry self-regulation is a kind of example of this. The idea is it's like you're kind of cooperating to make sure that you build something that's like good. And I think those two things can actually be in tension, where you can end up like losing all of these like potential mutual shared benefits by focusing a lot more on this kind of like rivalry. And so I guess like part of me is like, look, well, one thing you might want to do is like not focus so much on, or like at least like keep that in mind, and keep in mind that there are huge benefits from these systems. Like these systems can be applied to like healthcare, they can be applied to education, and this is true across many countries. And I think it's easy to focus on like leadership and not on something like how do we make sure internationally that this like goes really well. And so I think that is like what is important. And I think since the question was what should you do and not do, maybe that could be my like what you should do portion of it. My what should you not do? I think it's like don't ignore the fact that we are currently in a stage where I think that like direct action that like removes options is like probably premature. This is a stage in which you're gathering information about this technology. It's a stage in which you are doing things like trying to create norms. And so the norms that are put in place now might be like the norms internationally that go forward. And I think people can forget that when they take these actions, they are propagating norms. So think about what kind of norms you want to happen internationally over the next like 5-10 years. And don't think just about like what is happening like right now and how to like get ahead. I think that's like a kind of like narrow view that can actually be kind of harmful. So yeah, that's probably a little bit stereotypical Bay Area as a view, but it is in fact the view that I personally, at least for the time being, hold. So
Well, so that's great, and actually it leads to my last question, or a little bit of a lightning round here before we open it up to the audience, which is your point about international cooperation on AI and the notion of sort of mutual benefit. Raises the question of what we would like to happen versus what we think is most likely to happen. So what I would like each of the panelists now to do is assess the prospects for, I want to say, meaningful international cooperation as opposed to competition in AI. Is that likely? Who knows, or sort of unlikely?
It's a lightning round, right? So short answers. I'm optimistic.
I mean, a little more than that. Why are you optimistic, Ashley?
I think it's so widespread. I mean, I think, to some of the points that have been made, I mean, AI is everywhere. I mean, you hear this, this conversation. What if AI gets into the hands of,
Yeah.
It's like
what does that mean?
At this point, it's like saying, what happens if math gets into the hands of these
Right.
people?
Like,
what will they do with it?
Do they have phones?
This machine learning is just a way. It's like an evolution of the way we do computer programming, and it's
Right.
everywhere from the systems we make to the back end, back office automation. So I think as that sinks into the fabric, we're going to get to a point of ubiquity. I think we're all in a situation where I think we're running a society-wide experiment on what happens when you put machine learning enabled systems into complex environments. And I think that it's going to be a lot easier to make progress if we're running those experiments as a society versus in silos.
I think an interesting side note on the ubiquity piece is that when we have solved problems as an intellectual community, as a scientific community in this area, we tend to call them programming, whereas the thing that is next is always AI. Elsa.
I suppose I would say that cooperation is very much the status quo in AI, including between the United States and China, for better and for worse. Because that really does cut both ways, depending on what particular applications you're talking about, and some of the negative externalities that come into play. And I think in order to sustain cooperation going forward in a manner that is sustainable and appropriate, as well as consistent with our ethics and values, there has to be some rethinking of what are appropriate parameters for that cooperation. So for instance, given the situation in Xinjiang today and ways in which, whereas here in the US we talk about concerns over bias that is inadvertent in AI systems, in the People's Republic of China today, that bias is deliberate and it's racially profiling and targeting of China's Uyghur population in ways that are really appalling and has been considered tantamount to a genocide in many respects when you look at the destruction of Uyghur culture and the fact that by some estimates over 1 million Uyghurs are detained in concentration camps today. And I wish I were being hyperbolic here, but based on all of the evidence that has come out, that is the reality. And these technologies are integral to the ways in which the Chinese government is trying to augment their existing coercive apparatus for control and repression, whether facial recognition or natural language processing or intelligent voice technologies are very much part and parcel of that repression. And I think when American companies and universities work with companies that are massively profiting from marketing those technologies to China's police state, I think that does pose some ethical dilemmas. And I think there should be an open debate and conversation about the risks and externalities and ways in which there are concerns of complicity in some cases. And again, some of China's AI unicorns have achieved that massive valuation and their profits because of the massive demand for these technologies from China's party state today. And I think that does, for some of the research collaborations and partnerships underway today, including companies like iFlyTech and SenseTime and others that have been quite closely tied to this operation, it does get into very tricky territory. And I think to take the conversation beyond that, I would say that I think having an understanding of what are potential red lines, what are appropriate parameters, working either with the Chinese military or on surveillance technologies, I think does pose more of a risk. And I think if there is a better understanding of what red lines or a red light should be, there can be a sustaining of more favorable cooperation in sectors and industries where there are real benefits and fewer of those negative externalities. So I think healthcare is a good example there, and work collaboratively on AI safety and surety are important going forward, but I do think we need to have that very difficult conversation about the ethical element of this and how to make sure that cooperation is sustained in a manner consistent with our values, while also recognizing that from the Chinese government's perspective, cooperation is a means to an end, a leveraging of international innovation resources to build up indigenous capabilities. So I think making sure the cooperation is ethical but also reciprocal is going to be really critical going forward.
So, Kara, I want to give this a little twist here for you, in that CNAS is doing a bunch of work now on 5G. Mm-hmm. Which has become an incredibly sort of controversial area. And when we talk about international cooperation, then, shifting the lens a little bit from AI to 5G, what's that going to look like? So
lucky for you, I was going to go there. So we've talked a little bit about being increasingly circumspect because of China and their use and abuse of, the open research community that is the AI research community. But I think our allies and partners have a massive stake in this, as they've shown with 5G. Some have been more reticent to make final decisions than others. We've done an interesting job of trying to persuade them and bring them over to our point of view. But I do think that we do need to be sensitive to some of the issues that they're bearing. Rip and replace, all of these things, it's very expensive. It's just like storing data that we don't talk about. All of these things that we don't think about, it's very expensive to completely recalibrate their entire apparatus. And Huawei, I didn't want to say it, sorry Elsa, but certain companies are doing a good job of vertically integrating and making everything cheap and being subsidized and available in one package. So we do need to think about all of those things when we think about the future, when we're talking about this going forward. And I think that allies, this is a great opportunity. We can start to present the way that we want this technology to be governed. We can say, hey, we have the same values, and this is why these values should be propagated writ large, and this is why it's important. Here are the systemic security risks that you're going to get when you have a technology originating and emanating from a certain place that doesn't have the free press, the independent judiciary, that has different precepts than we do, like intelligence laws that compel certain private companies to give the government information. So I think by trending toward that end and trying to convince our allies that we can do this together, not necessarily making a binary choice, but at the same time presenting to them what are persuasive ways to move forward, I think that's really, really important. But I don't think that we think enough about how certain countries are surreptitiously integrating themselves into these international standards bodies too. So that's one thing I don't think we've mentioned yet. So there's a research component. You don't want universities in the US to contribute to CRISPR or any of those developments or how it's being used in Xinjiang. But at the same time, there are overt ways to try to use standards as a weapon. And I don't think we talk about that enough. And we do know that China is at the forefront of purveying that method of attack as small and less overt that it might be. So I think those are ways to think about international cooperation and then being more concerned of how we interact with the new world order.
And in 5G, it seems like the standard setting debate will be particularly important.
I think so.
So Amanda, you outlined in your last answer the positive cooperative world that you want us to get to. Mm-hmm. Are you optimistic that we will get there?
Yeah, I think on net I am. So maybe this relates to some of the stuff that people have been talking about. So I guess when I see this space, I sometimes think that people are inclined to think of it in this very zero-sum way, in this very kind of classical their loss is my gain, my loss is their gain sort of way. And it's just so trivially not the case with this technology. Because this is a kind of omni-use technology, so you have a language model, it can be misused, but it can also be used for writing assistance and for a variety of kind of purposes. And it's the same with almost all of these systems. This is very much positive sum. And so I think that when that is the case, you should be more optimistic about the ability to work together on some of those to achieve some of those shared gains. I also think that there's a lot of negative and positive spirals that it's possible to get into here. And I think that because of the fact that there's a lot of potential for shared gain internationally here, I like to think that we'll end up in positive spirals. I think that involves doing certain things to avoid ending up in negative spirals, though. It is interesting that when it comes to forming trust between, say, companies, but also, between any two parties, it's very easy to, think they just want to get something out of this, whereas I'm doing it because, I'm a really great person. And that's, an example of a kind of negative spiral that it's kind of easy to get into. And it's sometimes you should just maybe go out on a limb, and if someone wants to cooperate, if people want to cooperate on something like healthcare or on something like safety, kind of taking them at their word on it and being this is a fairly low-cost thing for us to cooperate on. And rather than say, well, what's in it for them, because they must have this zero-sum kind of thinking going on as well, trying to create a positive spiral of the form, we're actually just trying to get shared gains here. So this is the kind of I don't think that this view is in fact it can sound really rosy, but when you get into the details of it, I am look, the positive benefits of getting this right are so high that if people were to not see that and were to ignore it, I would just be what's gone wrong here? And similarly, the costs of getting it wrong are also really high. And so when it comes to that kind of environment, I just think that you have to, in the end, that just makes cooperation rational. So sometimes when I think I look and I'm deep down, cooperation here is just very rational, and that makes me, the kind of part of me that has done some game theories, people will end up doing it. So maybe that's my kind of optimism, but with the flavor of there are a lot of feedback cycles here, and so it's really important to try to get into that positive spiral and try to avoid that negative spiral.
So you say, how could somebody possibly get this wrong? And then I imagine season 8 of Game of Thrones or something, and it just, seriously.
I just want to point out I haven't watched it yet, so no spoilers.
I wasn't going to say anything else.
Spoilers.
All right, so we got about 10, 15 minutes left for questions. Please keep your questions concise. Please keep your answers shorter. In the front. I think there's a microphone to come around.
So I can project. Amanda, you're brilliant. All of you are. And I'm so pleased to be here. Please post your slides, by the way. I thought your slides were wonderful.
Thank you.
You touched a little bit on ethics. You touched a little bit on standards of norms, but we're talking about it in terms of strategic game in a nation state to nation state. But we all know it's really in the private sector and the standards of norms of how we do that. That's my direct question. And then the other issue is specifically, how do we inject ethics into the DevOps process?
All right. Who wants to take this on? Amanda, you want to start? Ashley, maybe you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a difficult problem. So if the question is like the ethics of like, who should companies engage with? I can put my ethicist hat on, I guess, but there's like a lot of uncertainty here. So basically, I think one way of framing this is maybe it's just like kind of a question. So I think that like a lot of people think like, look, as a company, you shouldn't be building things that are actually like harmful, right? So like a lot of people are going to agree with that. Then people are going to be like, well, what about the case of a technology where its use is like currently uncertain and you think it could actually be misused, but you can make it better? I think that's actually a really difficult ethical problem for a company to be in. So imagine you have, this could be true of facial recognition, where like in the US, it's currently like, well, what's going to happen with that technology? Or maybe another example is like systems that are used to give out, to determine like someone's rate or whether they're accepted or rejected for a loan. Now there's like, imagine you're a company and you can say reduce bias in that system, but you think it will in fact be deployed and you're not sure if you can completely get rid of it. And you know that if you can like reduce the bias of that system, it's more likely to be deployed more widely. I think that's there's a real problem. Like, should I work on this system that I can make better, but I am worried is going to be used in a way that is like not responsible by the bank that is using it. And I think that a lot of the cases that we're talking about aren't necessarily of the form, should I build this system that harms people? I think a lot of companies are going to be like, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to come in 9 to 5 working on a system that hurts people. Like, that's, just not in my, that's not why I got into this. But with things like, what about when I can make a system better, but I'm unsure about how it's going to be used? That is like a really difficult ethical problem. And so I'm not giving a good answer. I'm more saying something like these. I think when you actually get into the specific questions of like, what is the choice that I am faced with as a company, those are the kind of like complexities that come into it.
To this point, just to build on it, one of the things we're thinking through is how you get ethicists embedded in project teams, in development teams. That's how you get it into the DevOps. It's a talent problem at the end of the day. So you need folks like Amanda and others that have a background in ethics, understand enough of the technology to get embedded with the technical teams.
And I'll just add very quickly on the intersection of how norms and ethics are formed. There's also an element of geopolitics there sometimes as well. And I'd point, for instance, to the so-called Beijing Consensus on AI Principles that came out not long ago. And I think on one hand, it is very encouraging that a number of companies and researchers in China are engaging with issues of AI ethics and safety. I'm heartened to see that. I think there's definitely ways to pursue positive engagement and coordination on these principles. At the same time, the preamble to this document talked about the healthy development to promote the construction of a community of common destiny. That is a concept straight from Xi Jinping's ideology and straight from how Chinese leaders think about trying to reshape global governance to expand their own influence. So I think there can be some asymmetries, whereas the process of trying to formulate norms and ethics in the United States and many democracies is very much driven by companies and by individual researchers who do so with open conversation in which there's a degree of autonomy and independence relative to the government, whereas in China there are a number of different stakeholders involved, but it's occurring within a framework and parameters where the government does have perhaps a greater role in shaping that, and China's AI plan, in fact, was quite explicit about wanting to lead in global governance. And I think when we think about the sort of some of the principles from the document, be good, be ethical, relative to how the Chinese government is using AI today in practice. I think there are some reasons to recognize some of those realities and asymmetries and think critically about how best to engage a range of different stakeholders on ethics and norms going forward.
Not just global governance, but monitoring and enforcement.
Yes,
That's the issue.
absolutely.
Another question, how about in the front here? And why don't we take two at the same time, since we're gonna run out of time here. So then maybe move the microphone back to there.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Just wanted to talk about export controls. One of the big things Department of Commerce is doing right now, emerging foundational technologies. You mentioned AI directly. Curious to hear your guys' thoughts on should the U.S. wall off in AI, and more broadly, kind of how can we make sure that this is done in a proper way?
And my question is going to the point that was made a little bit earlier about AI surety. So you can talk a little bit about algorithm surety or lack thereof and the potential for data poisoning to influence the outputs from AI and machine learning.
All right, very simple questions. Algorithm surety and export controls. Why don't everybody take a quick stab at whatever of that you wanna answer.
Yeah, for export controls, I think, as we talked about before, the technology is so diffuse to try to pin it down. It's virtually impossible. So I think that's, and it's not providing the private sector the right incentives to get this right, as the man has been saying over and over again. So I'm sort of skeptical that they're going to be as efficient. Yet at the same time, if certain aspects of these systems are used deliberately, then I think there should be an imposition of some costs to private sector if they are complicit in gross human rights abuses and they know it. If there's also an element of transparency that has to happen, and an element of, yes, I'm saying yes to doing this, I know exactly where it goes, and this is why I'm doing it. Impose costs for sure at that point. But in terms of, the diffuse nature of the technology, it's going to be very, very difficult to put a handle on it, and costly too.
And I'd just add that I think insofar as the export controls are at least in part aimed to prevent exploitation of the openness of our innovation ecosystem by countries such as China that have a long history of tech transfer and industrial espionage, I think one way to approach that is to identify specific and discrete technologies where there is a real risk of such targeting based on recent incidents, for instance, and identify where the U.S. has a more unique and tangible advantage. So some of the hardware, for instance, is a little bit more tangible than the algorithms, software, and sort of more diffuse elements of AI. So I think in some respects, export controls may be an instrument ill-suited to a number of the emerging technologies to which it's looking to be expanded. But at the same time, I think it is important to have a narrow, targeted, and carefully calibrated approach to identifying where there are certain unique technologies where American companies and universities have advantages and where there are active efforts to access and exploit those technologies, whether through licit or illicit means. Then very quickly on surety, I will defer to the technical experts there, but I'll just say that Chinese military strategists quite actively write about ways to think about exploiting enemy AI, including through data poisoning or through trying to undermine an adversary's systems. So I think there are real reasons to think quite critically about those questions, including because with AI, as with any technology, with capability comes potential vulnerability, and it's not yet clear, given some of the flaws and weaknesses that appear to be inherent to certain algorithms, whether AI as a domain of technology, so to speak, will be offense or defense dominant, and what the balance will look like going forward between attempts to exploit and solutions for protection.
Yeah, just to really build on the excellent comments. We know, first of all, again, just to reiterate the theme, I think the real world is still our biggest adversary for a lot of these AI-enabled systems. The natural environment is going to run many experiments on your system that you hadn't anticipated in development. So just to say that. But to your excellent point, though, there are many now sort of human adversarial influences that can be had on the system, from messing with the perception, from the training time and the backdoors you might put in, to putting a patch on a stop sign, to even kind of behavioral sort of exploitations that can happen in the natural course of the operation of the system. So, I think one of the things that's different, if you think about everything in the open source, there's this open source substrate in the technologies, the frameworks, the data, and so I think we sort of all benefit by having a very robust substrate. And so I think we need to sort of band together in making sure that we have this immune system, you know, to go to the cybersecurity kind of analogy. When we have these zero-day, problems that crop up, we need an immune system that sort of will learn what the counter is to that, and then make for a solid sort of substrate. So I think, to your point about, you know, sort of positive-sum games, I see that aspect of it as a positive-sum game. It may be when you get a little bit more sophisticated in terms of military applications, that's where thornier questions might arise.
Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, I can give my kind of like personal views on export controls, although with that like large caveat plus a large caveat of uncertainty, I'm just like, what systems are people talking about? Like, what control? Like, you know, like there's machine learning in like almost in everything, and so it's kind of like, well, like specify what you're thinking. And is it just like now I can't like? Does it include phones? Does it include like web application? Like what are we talking? Like A/B testing? Like this is like I think this is like a kind of key problem of like, well, like what is it? And it's kind of everywhere. So that makes me like a little bit, you know, like I would need to see the specifics, but I'm worried that the specifics are like inevitably not going to be there. I think. And again, these are just kind of like my personal observations where I'm like, look, the AI community is like such an international one, and also one that thrives on research, and one that is like where companies can arise anywhere, basically. You know, you're much less like restricted. And so part of me is like, if you had really strong, like say export controls, and that meant that researchers were restricted on what they could do you really expect an academic who's thinking of going into industry or starting a company to like do it in the US or to do it elsewhere? And so it's the kind of thing where these sorts of things can they can really hamper innovation, I think. And again, with this like large degree of uncertainty, I just look at it and I'm like, I just don't know what systems people are talking about. I think that this doesn't seem like the kind of context where, like, at least historically, you know, export controls were, for example, like used in a way that like prevented like people from posting research or from having like foreign scientists work on things. And I'm like, I just kind of can't imagine an AI industry flourishing without those things. So I guess that's what makes it seem both like the target is unclear, and it's really unclear to me why that would be like a good thing. So yeah, like, but with the caveat of like personal views and uncertainty, I guess, on all of that.
Well, I feel like we could go on all afternoon about this. By the way, this guy, awesome sock game. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I have learned a lot from this discussion. I hope you have as well. So please join me in thanking our tremendous panelists. And you know, CNAS is doing a lot of research in this area. You know, AI, high-tech illiberalism, 5G, et cetera. So you know, check out all the work.